like to now properly introduce our first speaker. He's been in the role since January 2020, so what a time to have started in, in this particular role, leading global supply chain operations along with assembly, propulsion, stamping, material launch execution, and demand supply planning and scheduling organizations. He represents GM's global purchasing and supply chain team on its North America staff. Been with General Motors around 33 years as well. It's my pleasure to welcome Executive Director, Global Supply Chain, Dave Leich. Thanks so much,
Great
Dave.
to see you, Chris.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great to be here. First of all, what a great two-day event this has been. I think let's take a minute for the Automotive Logistics Supply Chain Organization. Certainly excited to be here to kind of wrap up day two. I do have a few slides really just to kind of kick off some of the topics that we're going to discuss. And as Chris mentioned, I started my role in leading global supply chain at General Motors in January of 2020. It's been a hell of a ride, that's all I can say. I want to start with a slide here that, I think maybe won't be surprising to people, but at the same time, I think it's some interesting information. Us as supply chain professionals, we're dealing with over 200 unique supply chain potential disruptive events every single week around the globe. So it's the velocity continues. We're not really seeing it slow down. I think some interesting company stats, supply chain being mentioned within 94% of recent earnings for companies. So typically supply chain is not mentioned in earnings calls. 94% of companies mention supply chain issues within their recent earning calls. Supply chain disruptions have cost companies on average 45% of a year's profitability. It's pretty significant. GM typically, we average about 12 to 14 billion in EBIT a year, so that's a pretty sizable impact if you're talking 45% of that. I think as we look forward in terms of resiliency, some good stats here in terms of where we're at today from a baseline, knowing that we have to get better. Only 22% of companies have a proactive supply chain network, and then only 6% of companies report that they have full supply chain visibility. So we have a long ways to go. So we're going to talk about some of the things that we need to do to improve on that. Again, none of these are surprises to anyone, but I want to look backwards a little bit before we talk about going forward. And certainly starting in January of 2020, when I started my role, the pandemic started, this thing called COVID-19 in China, certainly started what has become the most difficult supply chain crisis, that we've ever seen. From my perspective and from an automotive perspective, I really think the semiconductor crisis that we've heard about in the last year and a half really has been by far the most complex and challenging crisis that the auto industry has ever seen and will ever see. And the reason I say that is, a few things around the semiconductor crisis. Number one is all of the issues are very, very deep in the sub-tier. Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5. So there's a complete lack of visibility in terms of, where the constraints are. It's a significant cross-industry issue. So it's not an automotive issue. It's a cross-industry issue. Automotive is about 10% of the pie from a demand standpoint for semiconductors. So it's a cross-industry issue. And the proliferation of semiconductors is just absolutely massive. And so that really makes the complexity, I think, something like we really have never seen in our history. And I think that's going to really lead, automotive companies, especially GM, to really seek that visibility down to what we call Tier N. And I'll talk about some examples of that. But then there's just been so many compounding factors that have really led to the continued decimation of supply chains. The labor issues started with COVID. quite honestly, I think they're intensifying here over recent months. You know, the intercontinental supply chain is a mess with port delays, you know, container shortages, lead times that have, you know, more than doubled. We have, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is causing significant disruptions. There's been cybersecurity events, you know, throughout the industry. So we just continue to see one event after another. And so we don't know what the new normal is, but it doesn't feel like it's coming anytime soon. I tried to think of a slide that would depict what is the so what of the last 2.5 years for the auto industry. And I think this is the best slide that shows the so what for the automotive industry, especially locally here in the US. So this slide shows US vehicle inventories across all OEMs in the US over the last 20 years. If you look, you know, backwards to the left of the chart, you see the industry typically is in the 3 to 4 million range of vehicle inventory. If you look at the right side of the chart, you see just the massive, massive decline in inventory over the last 2 years between COVID and semiconductors. To lose 3 million units of inventory in a 2-year period is just absolutely unthinkable. You know, the industry got down to about 1 million units of inventory last July. And I think what's interesting is, you know, if you look at the tail at the bottom that's circled on the bottom right, that's 15 data points. So in 15 months, we've gone from 1 million units to 1.3 million units in 15 months. And the typical is 4 million. So from an industry standpoint, we are a long ways away from getting back to what we would call normal in terms of inventory levels. I don't think that we'll ever get back as an industry up to this 4 million level, because I think we have learned a lot about you know, managing with leaner inventories. But nonetheless, it's going to take the industry years to rebuild. So what does that mean for all of us? That means all the OEMs, including General Motors, want to work max overtime. Supply is decoupled from demand. Inventories are so low that it doesn't matter what demand is for automobiles. All the OEMs are going to want to work max production for the next couple of years because we have so much inventory to rebuild. So that's going to continue to put more stress, more strain on our logistics network, the supply chain network, the labor situation that we have, you know, in particular in North America as well as around the world. So I thought that chart was pretty interesting. So we have a long ways to go. And then this will be my last chart before we transition to just more open discussion. I really started thinking of, you know, what would be words, adjectives that I would just want to throw on a page here from a GM standpoint, both as I look backwards over the last 2 years from a learning standpoint, and as I look forward based on things that I know we need to do. And so these will be some of the topics that we'll talk about here today. You know, I would just say that, you know, I've been in automotive for 33 years, spent a lot of that time within supply chain, spent a lot of time in, you know, multiple plants and operations. Last two and a half years have been by far the most difficult of my career. I'm sure a lot of you can say the same. But what really excites me is how much we have learned over the last couple of years, both around, you know, tools and processes and also around behaviors. And I think that's really what excites me is, you know, the transformation that I think we're going to see across the supply chain in the coming years. Chris?
We could leave that slide up now and again, and maybe we'll come back to it, I think, a few times, because I actually do think it perfectly captures many of the points that we've been circling around over the last 2 days and in many ways building to. We should also clarify that as far as we know, Dave starting his role had nothing to do with the start of all of this disruption in the supply chain. Yeah. So let's just also make that very clear. And great points there. I mean, 94% of earnings calls. That really drives home why. That was something discussed in another forum. We talk about visibility at senior levels of supply chain logistics, even beyond Matt's mother, at board level. But the CFO seemed to have been one that was coming up. The CFO is paying a lot of attention to supply chain logistics. If there was any understanding or lack of understanding as to why, that slide really showed it. Just a few questions with you, Dave, before we bring on our other panelists to get into it. We know that some of the things that GM has done to mitigate the crisis and to help make decisions has been to invest, and perhaps even sort of invest more than normal in capacity for logistics and even for some suppliers. Can you just talk a little bit about that and how much of a change that was compared to how you would have previously operated?
Yeah, we have seen significant changes out of necessity in terms of really having to be very proactive around securing logistics capacity. As you see lead times increasing significantly, from a vessel standpoint, you see the wrong container at the wrong place at the wrong time. So how do you overcome that? The rail network, the rail infrastructure is challenged, and so we have many examples where we were very, very proactive in securing additional capacity to make sure we could sustain our operations. From a business case standpoint, at least for General Motors, logistics is very expensive, but losing EBIT and revenue of lost production far outweighs the logistics cost. So we really don't want logistics to get in the way of impacting our production. And so maybe a couple examples where we've done things differently than we've had to in the past. Going back to Q1 of 2020 with the onset of COVID-19, we have a pretty extensive supplier footprint in China that ship and supply our GM manufacturing plants here in North America. And as we started to understand more about this thing called COVID-19, we had a whole team that was mapping, this was before it was a pandemic, we had a whole team mapping, the progress of COVID-19 through China, and we're seeing regions shutting down. We're anticipating our vessel pipeline is just going to start to really deplete between China and North America. So very early on, and I think especially knowing this was an industry thing, it wasn't just an automotive thing. A lot of goods we know come out of China. So very early on, we knew that logistics capacity was going to be very important for us as we stripped our vessel pipeline. So we went ahead and secured 2 months worth of extra logistics capacity all at one time. We kind of timed that out to the point where we knew our vessel pipelines would potentially be exhausted. We didn't know what was going to happen with COVID because it was still early, but in terms of being proactive, we wanted to secure that capacity. We secured air freight capacity, we secured additional vessel capacity. We called them fast boats. So these were smaller vessels, more dedicated, cut the lead time significantly going across the ocean. We then later saw in future weeks, the pricing just went through the roof because, the Walmarts of the world, everybody is now trying to figure out how are we going to get goods from China to North America because the vessel pipeline has been stripped. And so we were very proactive in doing that. It worked out very well for us. We're able to continue to keep all of our operations flowing within North America. So lots of examples of leveraging logistics capacity to sustain our operations.
Let's pick out the point you made on the tier N. And that was something for those who weren't in the earlier session. Stellantis also said they're making a very concerted effort with some new tools and processes to plan and predict capacities straight up, much further out in the tier N supply chain. Can you give us a sense of how you're doing that and what kind of areas you're looking at in the tier N supply chain?
Yes. Yeah. So I think first I'll start with pre-pandemic what we were doing. We saw a need to get more supply chain visibility several years ago. So we started probably 6 or 7 years ago really getting visibility down at least to tier 2. So we worked with all of our tier 1s to get all of those tier 2 connections. We developed a visibility and mapping tool that we have all of our tier 1 suppliers, all of our tier 2 suppliers fully mapped within this visibility tool. We have a system where we get global real-time alerts to potential disruptive events. It bounces against this visibility tool, and literally within minutes, we can see from a GM standpoint what type of exposure might we have. There might have been I wake up in the morning and I have this alert that there was a factory fire at a facility in Germany. Within minutes, I can see, does this have any exposure to General Motors at Tier 1 or at Tier 2? It's also linked to our bill of material. We can quickly see which parts, which plants, what's our coverage. So that tool has been very, very helpful for us over the last many years. Then the semiconductor crisis came. The issues are Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5. That tool was useless. So about a year and a half ago, we started mapping down to Tier N in the semiconductor space. And so, beyond our Tier 1s, you have front-end semiconductor manufacturing, back-end manufacturing, you have the wafer fabrication. And so we fully mapped our entire semiconductor supply chain for all of our electronic modules. And the benefits have just been absolutely phenomenal. First of all, it's allowed us to really engage with the sub-tier. So our Tier 1s will come to us saying, hey, we have this chip shortage. We engage with them. We've built and developed relationships with all of the semiconductor providers. And GM, certainly has some influence, so we can work with the Tier 1s. We have what we call, 3-way, 4-way, 5-way calls. That's how many levels of tiers. We get everyone on the call, talk about where the constraint is, what do we need to do collectively, and it's amazing what solutions get generated as you have those relationships built down throughout the sub-tier. And with a company like GM, what type of influence, that we can have. I think the other thing is, as we built these relationships with the sub-tier, some of them have led to commercial relationships where we now have, I'll say, more of a say in the sub-tier. And we invite all of these sub-tiers now into our supplier business meetings. So they're a part of the GM team. We never had done that before with sub-tiers. It was always at Tier 1. So they see our production forecasts. They understand what GM's vision is, what our new launches are, what our long-term demand is. And so it's been fascinating. So we're going to continue to do that across our other commodities.
That's great. And a question for you before I bring on some of our other panelists to go multiple perspectives. So, we're talking about tools. There's obviously technologies that can support what we're doing. But one thing that's come up in other parts of the event as well, the people's behavior, relationships, and of course partnerships are critical. So what would you point to, important behavioral changes in the way the team organizes or the way you work with your providers and suppliers?
Yeah, I'll maybe give a quick internal perspective and then some external perspective. From an internal standpoint, early on in the crisis, as everybody did, you develop this crisis team, and so we developed this large cross-functional crisis team. And so we had, reps from purchasing, supply chain, logistics, engineering, manufacturing, public policy, government relations, communications, and finance, and probably more. And we had dedicated resources, and still do, on this cross-functional team. And early on, it's natural that everybody has their silos, right? It's amazing what we've seen as you take those silos down, and we have a behavior that we talk about at GM. It's working as one team. What is best for the enterprise, not what's best for your function. And it's amazing. We've had our supply chain team as sort of the conduit. So my team, does all the connections with our CEO and our senior leadership team, and then working back through this cross-functional team so we can align on priorities and objectives. And as everybody is working for what is best for the enterprise, it's absolutely incredible to see the innovation and the solutions that we come up with, whether it's an engineering solution, it's a sales and marketing solution, it's a manufacturing solution, to steer around all of the different constraints that we've had. So it's been amazing from an internal perspective. And I think similarly from an external perspective, for us it's really all about relationships. So we say relationships matter. And so with our supply base, our stance is your problem is our problem. we do not take a punitive stance with suppliers if there's an issue. Their problem is our problem. We are here to help. We have resources that can go on site to our suppliers. We have these calls without, throughout the sub-tier to really look for, what are opportunities to solve the problem. And we have lots of levers internally. We can adjust schedules. We have really smart engineering resources that can look for substitutions. We can do a lot of things if we know about the issues. So we partner, we collaborate with our suppliers. We ask for early visibility of issues so that we can collectively have time to solve it. And it's been very, very powerful.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, let's bring some of our other panelists on. So Dave, why don't you take a seat? Thanks so much for the dedicated insight for us. And I would also actually, you started kindly by thanking us. I would also like to thank you and General Motors for the engagement over the last days and in the months leading up to this. That's really been a fantastic way to help us plan our event too. With Edgar Pezzo from Logistics yesterday, we had Jeremy Galanti on sustainability and packaging, and obviously now with David. And that support went right up to Jeff Morrison, VP of Global Purchasing and Supply Chain, who we know from the days when he was working in logistics, of course, in Europe and North America. So someone who clearly knows the challenges well. So thanks again to all of the support and planning with us in that collaboration. But I'd also, now as said, we're going to bring some more perspectives into the panel for the last 30 minutes. And again, I'll hope to have some questions from you as well. So to join me on stage, I'd like to introduce two further. First is Senior Vice President, Solutions Engineering and Innovation at Syncreon, a company that was recently acquired by DP World. Mike Valentine began working in the supply chain over 25 years ago, mainly in automotive, and has held numerous roles, and really glad that you can join us here to the mic and share some insights. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, have a seat. And also joining us, Thorsten Meincke is a member of the management board for global air and ocean freight at DB Schenker, and he's been on the role since 2019, having previously served as head of global ocean freight at Kuehne + Nagel and a number of other logistics and freight forwarding companies, and certainly has pretty important perspectives to share given the current disruption we're facing. Thank you so much, Thorsten.
Thank you. Hi, David. Hi, Mike.
So I want to kick it off with some perspectives from our providers and partners here on the stage. You heard David talk about how GM reacted to invest in capacity from early on, and I'm just interested, starting with you on this, Thorsten. What has your experience been, and how customers have worked with you in this way, perhaps to try to get ahead of some of that disruption, or not, in terms of reacting to it in the ocean and air space, for example?
Yes, thank you very much. So. We working with a lot of customers, we indeed have seen within that crisis that there was a big change coming towards us, and customers reacted in different ways. So if I digitalize it a little bit, there has been one group who has been, let's say, continuing with more like a procurement focus, so looking on rate levels and trying to maintain contracts in place. And there's been another group who has been focusing on supply chain resilience, like what do I need to do to get my supply chain up and running. So, and if I shortcut it, the second group at the very end came out with very good EBIT results because they could at the end, and Dave, you said it, serve their customers, and others struggled partially heavily and often even tried to overcome it by trying to do transportation by itself, and some of them even not recovering really from this. So that is what we see. So resilience means to react on immediate supply chain restrictions, and that all happened very fast. So if you all remember, the problem started when, for example, the US decided overnight any flight into the US will get interrupted. That, for example, on the freight side meant close to 70% of the entire freight capacity which was running in passenger aircrafts was overnight gone. So we secured from the limited amount of space available charter freight, and then we helped customers. And with this less capacity there, it rippled over into ocean. And when you see that, we talked about the increasing supply chain lead times. So nowadays, from Long Beach to Detroit, if I take GM as an example, we talk now 70 plus days coming from 35. But this is only when you're on the boat. When the boat and the on-carriage, which is causing the main problem. So the cause of the problem was not the ocean vessel, but the land infrastructure with all the people not handling it. When it takes twice the time, that means half of the capacity is out. So the second dimension was everybody was fighting to get on the boat before you get the 77 days. Yeah. and this is where customers are been very different in making fast and quick decisions, and others not.
Yeah, I mean, it perfectly encapsulates how traditionally at an event like this, we would have been talking about, maybe a presentation on how GM would have reduced its air freight spend in a year, and that obviously would have been cited as quite a good thing. But in this scenario, an example could have shown why increasing that saved so much else and stuff. And to your point of getting ahead, and those who invested in it as opposed to cut, may have made a strategic gain on that. Mike, I'm interested to hear from your point of view. I know you're also overseeing lots of warehouse and other kind of labor areas. So from whether it's from the logistics capacity or perhaps also looking at it from a labor point of view.
Yeah, from a contract logistics standpoint, my experiences throughout the pandemic and the other crises that seem to keep coming is very similar. Lines up very well with Thorsten's view of what he's seen, kind of called bipolar approaches from customers and large companies. Those that very early on were still focused on cost, sticking to budgets, sticking to contract terms. And then we had other customers that very quickly understood that this was a new world and having to jump into that new world by doing things they wouldn't normally do, like chasing wage rates, for instance. I mean, it's very hard to get labor into a warehouse in the last 3 years, especially in the US with the assistance programs. So those companies that quickly knew they had to incur costs, took those steps, were able to secure labor, first of all, and then we were able to work with them to stand up new warehouse space as they needed it to add additional buffers in the supply chain.
I find it very timely and important points because, to your point earlier, Dave, as well. I mean, maybe we're heading to a recession, downturn, but that inventory level is still low, and there's perhaps important to learn those lessons again and say, okay, keep the priorities where they belong, whether it's on labor or the capacity, and be careful about what maybe you worry about cutting, because there's going to be priorities to rebuild inventory and keep other things flowing. Yep. So I do think those are quite important points that really come out well. But I'm also interested to hear from the panel on some of the perhaps strategic steps that can help over the medium or longer term to address some of the capacity issues that we're dealing with and facing, be it on ocean, air, and indeed labor in logistics from a contract logistics side. So, Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, behaviors happen throughout the pandemic, and there's a lot of lessons learned. And you think about how long it lasted. We had plenty of time to learn those, and the question will be how many of those decisions, those new ways of interacting, new decision making, will actually become the norm. So there was decisions that companies were making in their capital expenditure program, in their logistics costs, that they would never have considered before in terms of alternate routings, additional inventory. So the question will be, once we're back to whatever normal is, how many of those companies will actually take that flexibility and supply chain risk into their decision making? How many companies will have that as part of their capital equipment discussions and ROI? How many will have it in performance reviews and annual bonus type measurements? So that's, I think, the real key is how many companies will really change the decision making to incorporate supply chain risk into it. And it's interesting to hear Dave talk about General Motors, the visibility tool that they have, and the way that they're starting to take those things into account. I think that's a huge area of software that you saw about 15 years ago kind of come new, supply chain risk, but not a lot of companies are using them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thorsten?
I think what comes together is a few elements. Is first, from a logistics point of view, visibility became super crucial. So first about, do you get on board, and when you're on board, when will it really arrive? And the data, what you get from carriers, is often not very reliable. So what it changed very much into overriding it into real predictive analytics, like when will what come. The other side was, it became across the supply chain fast, let me call it fast collaboration. So when in the past, every party, so let's say GM as an OEM, the tier ones, the tier twos, we in between as a transport provider, everybody did his job a little bit on his own. It suddenly moved into joint discussion on how do we act on what. So fast and quick decision with data was changing, and that was rounded up with you need to give promises to the carriers, like I take this amount of volume every week, and by that become more reliable and came on top of the list to be get shipped, and then giving the space to the prime customers.
Absolutely. Dave, some of what we were talking about earlier in terms of that tier-end visibility and integration certainly is a good, probably important step to some of those strategic steps to improve it. But anything you would add onto that, or based on what you?
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, we never want to be in this position again. First of all, and so we are taking really an end-to-end company approach to resiliency. It's not like what are we going to do different in logistics to make sure we have capacity. It's really an end-to-end approach, and so between purchasing, supply chain, logistics, engineering, manufacturing, finance, we are looking at really starting with sourcing. In the past, we didn't have resiliency factors into sourcing. You'd focus on the traditional KPIs of cost and quality and delivery, and we have now integrated resiliency into our sourcing process. As we look at, we've talked about forever the automotive industry being this lean, just-in-time, lean logistics network, lean inventories. Where I think we treated all parts kind of the same, we treated programs the same, we were lean, and now we're really looking at what should strategic inventories be based on, products that are in higher demand, based on products that maybe have more, revenue or EBIT. We have our engineering that's engaged in looking at how can we change some of the design and release strategies so that we can have more control of critical commodities within the sub-tier and have less reliance just on our tier ones for that. And then building those tools, that we've talked about. We're building dashboards where we have health metrics, logistics health metrics, supply chain health metrics, where our users have dashboards where they can quickly identify, leading indicators for risk. And so really having the visibility in the sub-tier, having the tools and dashboards to bring those issues and make it visible so that we can, make business decisions and take action.
Possibly partly as a follow-on to that, I mean, one of the key terms, flexibility, has been a byword across this discussions in terms of some of the pivots that have been needed on logistics modes, but also in terms of supply chains, scheduling, production prioritization, etc. Dave, as part of your responsibility is on some of the scheduling and planning sides of things. How have, behind the scenes to make it happen, what has been some of the key ingredients to enable that flexibility in such a greater way than we've previously seen?
Yeah, the amount of agility has just been phenomenal. And I think in the past, when we would have issues within the supply chain, they were typically short-lived. And so you maybe didn't have to resort to really, really crazy things because it would soon pass. But in this environment, we know that it's not soon passing. And so we have gotten really creative in leveraging, remixing, pulling options out of certain packages within vehicles where we may have constraints, leveraging engineering for solutions in terms of part substitutions. We've developed a whole team that focuses on the broker market, which is an area we never focused on before, where we can get, alternative supply. Another really unique strategy that you probably read in the paper is hearing about OEMs building without components and updating those vehicles at a later date when the components become available. We never, ever would have thought of doing that in the past. But when you're maxed out on capacity, you don't want to lose that precious manufacturing capacity, so you get creative in, we're going to build this vehicle less this component or module. We're going to make sure we protect the customer when the parts do come in and we update it. And that's a lot better than canceling the orders. You can get it to the customer much quicker. And so the agility has been pretty impressive. And what I'm excited about is now having all of these tools in our tool set going forward to be able to leverage that.
Absolutely. Thorsten, from a freight forwarding, looking at this sort of agility we've talked about, what is it meant for you in the way you work with carrier partners, with customers to enable some of the agility that we've seen in logistics as well?
Yeah, it's perfectly adding to it. So first of all, a key success model was to separate the orchestration of the transportation management with the available space you want to use. So basically what happened is you come with a contingency plan how to ship something, and then the contingency overnight suddenly was gone. So you need the contingency of the contingency. What it means, especially in the ocean shipping, is when different than trucks and aircraft, an ocean vessel can basically not react when there's an interruption in a port or whatever, because thousands of ships are on the water with hundreds of thousands of containers for certain destinations, and they basically cannot go somewhere else. So what they all do is constantly standing in queue. Consequences, when you normally have for a certain service a weekly departure, because of all this delay, certain departures simply disappear. And then you can wait for this carrier, for example, to take the cargo, but then that means the week after, twice the cargo hits the same vessel. So what you constantly need to do is, when you see this one will not make it, replan, and that was the big change. So the control tower basically constantly replanned. So when in the past you did one transport planning, you sometimes did 4 or 5 and could use the wide range of all carrier alternatives. That was the key game changer, and also brought back, let's say, everybody focus on what is good in transport planning, the carriers in execution, and production focus on where do I do what, and do reactions like Dave explained, like I start something when one component is missing and fit it in later.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, from a contract logistics point of view, similar, or are there other dimensions you'd add to
Yeah, I think I'll answer it from an automotive aftermarket
Yeah.
perspective, since we don't always give aftermarket
It's
its
true.
due.
That's a very good point.
Which is very high profitability, right,
Yes,
Dave?
it is. Yes, it is.
But the Amazon effect in the last 10 years of reducing delivery times, what we've seen in the market is most of our customers are now adding distribution centers in a given geography. So they've been doing that with the purpose of shortening the lead time. What they've also done, probably inadvertently, is add some resilience, because now they've got more nodes that they can shift. So what we've seen from operating distribution centers is when a customer has an issue in one of those, whether it's a localized weather event or tornado, fire, et cetera, they're able to quickly shift inventory, shift where they're fulfilling those fulfillment points from, and those companies have had less disruption to their supply chain and probably to their sales as well. So from our standpoint as a contract logistics provider, it's how do we allow them to quickly shift? How do we stand up new buildings for them? And for us, it's really about common process, common systems, and making sure that we're able to quickly turn those on for our customers.
Absolutely. One thing we heard from Dave was certainly increasing communication internally integrated across departments, and as we've illustrated as well with the tier N, and you bringing them into the sort of supplier councils and things like that. Again, I'm interested from the provider side in terms of your organizations and how some of that may have changed and adapted. And I'll start with you, Mike, not least because it's quite an important change, if you like, in Syncreon, I can imagine, over the last year with becoming part of DP World, whether that played a role in helping to address some of this, or if it was other areas. So let's start with you on that. Yeah.
So, Syncreon, we have been purchased by DP World, so we're part of the DP World family now. If you don't familiar with DP World, a port operator originally, been really aggressively expanding the supply chain offering. So by us coming in as a contract logistics provider, along with other freight forwarding and road freight companies, They're pursuing that premise, Chris, is that companies want to work with a company that has multiple services in the supply chain. So we are actively, aggressively filling out that portfolio. But on the flip side, we also do have customers that really that want multiple providers in a supply chain. So in those cases, as sitting as a contract logistics provider, we really see our view as being a good citizen in the supply chain, making sure that the links upstream and downstream from us are well oiled for the customer. So making sure that those communications are working well, even if usually we're working with competitors, but it's about serving the customer.
Thorsten, anything you would add to this from DB Schenker's side?
Basically said, so I think in this entire network, and when we, especially what you asked in your question on the tier N topic, we heard, for example, from the ship side, so suddenly tier 2 visibility was not good enough. Giving you another example, when jumping into the Ukraine crisis, which came parallel to the COVID crisis, there was suddenly a situation where a lot of suppliers could not deliver because of a completely unexpected topic, which was pallet shortages. And the pallet shortage came in because Euro pallets in Europe are used to build based on a special nail, which is out of a special steel, and that was exclusively produced in the Ukraine. So suddenly, and think about this, when you design your supply chain resilience, nobody thinks about nails for pallets. Where you
later shut down your network because of a nail.
Yeah.
So
the nail on the pallet.
So what we need to do is, even when we are very large corporations, cooperation and find jointly quick solutions is the key to success. And then everybody focusing on his core competency and fast and quick real-time collaboration. That's the key to success.
Just picking up on that is part of, I mean, for Dave is working hard to get to tier N. Whether you got to the nails in the pallet, I don't know. That's pretty far up or down. But do you see roles for your companies to help expand out that sort of visibility? And that's maybe a quite extreme example, but nonetheless, you reach into other parts of the supply chain, and make sure that gets fed back into the wider pool.
Yeah, so it's all about supply chain visibility, and with the examples Dave gave, it's basically not ending. And when we go back to supply chain conferences in the year 2000, we already started talking about we need supply chain visibility, and the reality is a few providers can really do it, and a lot of customers are able to use it, and then use the data to react. So yes, also we as a provider could help to go across the simple pull or push supply chain visibility and then move over into tier 2, tier 3 to really have then the reality in terms of who ships what from where to where, and is the production schedule on time. Yeah. So I think OEMs in that logic will probably much stronger orchestrate even production and inbound supply chains, not from a tier 1 to them, but even further, and that will be new. Yeah. Today, tier 1s are a very instrumental party who decide on a lot of logistics, but there will be more collaboration needed with the OEM.
Yeah, so there's if not vertical integration, at least a more vertical controlling or orchestration, as you put it. Which ties in nicely to a point I wanted to raise with you as well, Dave, on things like, we talked about another session on S&OP, sales and operation planning and coordination. That seems to be a function that is strongly connected to your role as well, and how that has evolved or is evolving for General Motors too.
Yeah, it has evolved a great deal in the last couple of years. I would say both from a frequency standpoint of our S&OP process, as well as the tools that we're using. And so maybe some examples, just from a frequency standpoint, our standard S&OP process is really a monthly process. We pull in our sales data, we look at our inventory levels, we look at our production forecast, and we make recommendations for change. Having monthly decisions when you have hourly issues is not going to work. So 2 years ago, we set up a weekly S&OP touch point directly with our CEO and her staff. And so, you know, my function presents every week to that forum to talk about, you know, what are the current risks, you know, what are we doing to try to steer around those risks, and what do we need to do in terms of production changes.
Yeah.
So having that ability to do that each and every week has been really powerful, and we can, you know, change priorities or, you know, get alignment very quickly. In terms of tools, I think a couple things. You know, we've built a constraint allocation tool. As we're dealing with so many constraints, you know, across all of our plants globally, we built this tool that essentially has all of the inputs of all of our plants, products, programs, volumes, and we can load all of the constraints into the tool, and we put inputs into it from a prioritization standpoint, and the tool tells us the most optimal way to allocate constrained parts, to optimize our priorities from a GM standpoint. So that tool's been very effective. And then we've also built a modeling tool, which is, I'd say, similar to that, but helps us with looking at future risks and future constraints in a similar fashion, where we can help to model the future risks, and it's, you know, one of the key inputs that goes into our financial forecast.
Yeah. So a lot, I mean, as you pointed, you know, more greater visibility shared with the top levels of the company, more tools to help calculate and optimize this. We talked already about more communication with supply base on these topics. So then to put it to the logistics provider, starting with you, Mike, and not obviously just specific to GM or anything, do you feel that on the logistics side you're getting enough of this communication, update, monitor level from your partners, OEM and Tier 1 partners, to sort of help cascade it through your contract logistics services as well?
Yeah, I would say it's varied.
Yeah.
It's varied, Chris. Some companies do a very good job, some of our customers do a very good job of that. Others, not so much. But it is something that we try to work on with all our customers, right? And it's sometimes not particularly with the customer so much as with their provider that's either upstream or downstream of us. You know, whether that's working on making sure dock door scheduling is more streamlined and ASN accuracy is there, or even as we've been moving more and more automation into the warehouse, supplier labeling can be an issue, where suppliers have labels coming in can often affect how a robot can pick it, see it, recognize it, and be able to put its own label on. So working on those upstream and downstream connections for us is really how we can help, you know, say, be a good citizen in the supply chain and keep those links oiled.
Anything you would add to that, Thorsten?
Well, our role is more to enable than to request. And when we look at this planning, what David described, like from monthly down to weekly or even shorter, all the planning is based on the data they are getting.
Yeah.
And if you take the reality today, for example, ocean carriers, they don't update every hour what is the expected time of arrival of a vessel, irrespective then port anchor time, dwell time, rail time, and so on. So what we do is we update the data based on our best expectations. So you can see where the ship is, you can see what the current speed is, you can calculate based on the schedule which you need to get from somewhere else when it most likely will arrive. So basically override data. So that's one role we have. And this is then enabling the better planning. And second, this visibility on these topics are not on transport level, they are on SKU level. So because the one SKU might be very important, the other not. So and that communication is what makes it then more resilient. And when the impact on the supply chain is there, and something is on water, then you cannot do something. But what you can do is to replan and see how you can maybe redirect a container from rail to truck and then catch up something. So that is where we step in.
Absolutely. We've got a couple minutes left. Is there any comments or questions from the audience that you wanted to raise with our panel here? Yeah, we have a question right here in the front. Is a mic coming behind you? Yeah, it's coming up on your right.
Mike Panicia, Farisha Interior Systems. I had a question for you, Dave, actually. Coming in January of 2020 and you talking about the real-time data integration that you've had to have more connection with your first, second, third tier suppliers has, since January, since you got in there, do you think GM has made a good push on being able to find these issues, for lack of a better word, before they come issues, and being able to mitigate those? Or is it still kind of a land of uncertainty for you guys?
Yeah, I think it's a journey. We're nowhere near where we want to be, but we are investing significantly. You know, with a big company like GM, one of the key things is we have so much data, we have so many different systems. We've been connecting all of our systems to make sure that we could have the right analytics. And now we're taking that and turning it into user-facing tools to where we can, I'll say, have key risk indicators and leading indicators. So I'd say we are nowhere near where we want to get to, but we are definitely making some significant improvements. But it's people investment, IT investment, and we are getting the full senior leadership support to invest in these tools. Good question. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks very much. Anyone else from the audience? Did they have a hand up? Don't think so there. Mike. Oh, you do have a question. Sorry, we'll keep it to the audience then. Please say your name and company.
Hi, this is Heidi from Tesla. So this question is for Thorsten. So I'm pretty sure like DB Schenker work with a lot of like a different automotive company, right? So my question for you is like, what is the biggest concern from your customer, and how do DB Schenker as a company prepare to address like the biggest concern from your customer right now?
So you could not understand the last part?
I said like, what is the biggest concern from your automotive customer right now, and how do DB Schenker as a company prepare to address this concern?
Yeah. So the biggest concern we get is, do we have frequent, regular capacity?
Yeah.
And this is what we manage with multi-carrier logic. So as I explained, the interruptions will always be there. Hopefully not so heavy as today, but the overall capacity, as I explained on the ocean side, if there is a vessel not going, you need to find an alternative. And if you use the way of I assign one supply chain to one carrier and they manage it, then you have basically a 0-1 situation. Either it works or not. And 0-1 means in the week after it doesn't work. So what we see is a clear need for a multi alternative version and orchestrating this. That's topic one. And if you take the picture bigger and put air freight into the big picture, that sometimes helps to overcome. But the air freight supply chain, not only from a sustainability point of view, but also from a capacity point of view, can basically not solve supply chain problems. So total air freight capacity is just 1% of the total ocean capacity. So you see a slight interference in ocean, air freight can never catch up. And then during COVID, even half of it was cut out. So air freight can solve things, but it's cost sustainable wise not really a solution. And so then it drives into all the unpredictability will stay, and the best solution is have multi-carrier solutions. That's the simple answer. It's a clear demand we see, orchestrating it across all possibilities. Good enough answer?
Thank you for the questions. We'll come near to the end. Mike, well, one thing I wanted to ask you, looking across all of the areas of contract logistics, labor, in warehouses, etc. With this limited supply and high cost, has that driven more investment in automation technologies? We've talked more about things like data analytics, for example, but what about actual automation in logistics?
Yeah, absolutely. The amount of automation that's gone into warehouses since COVID started is, I mean, I don't even know, it's exponential. I think if you order a AMR right now, it's 6 months. Depending if it's specialized, might be up to a year to get it made. But so a lot of what you see is automation in the warehouse, because when you think about contract logistics, labor is our largest cost. And when you looked at what happened here in the U.S., we had some markets where a forklift driver wages went from $18 to $28 an hour in 16 months, right? And then just being able to get people in the door, especially to handle peaks and those kind of things, is very difficult. In the meantime, cost for technology keeps coming down. So what used to be a business, we'd look at business cases in our business, and it'd be somewhere to 5 to 7 years, and our contracts are usually 3 to 5 year contracts. That doesn't work. But recently, with the cost coming down of tech and labor skyrocketing, those business cases make a lot more sense now within the lifetime of a contract. So we're not the only ones, don't get me wrong. Our competitors are doing it too. But you're seeing a lot of automation in the warehouse, autonomous mobile robots, robotic picking and packing, for instance, and then also on the back end and back office, our automation as well. So I think the area that excites me the most, though, is machine vision. So not to get too excited here, but machine vision to me is really an area that we're going to see a lot of progress and impact in the warehouse. Their vendors are starting to put them onto AMRs, put them onto forklifts, and when you think about the end result there is not, basically making the RF scanner obsolete, making the scan gun obsolete in the warehouse, which, takes time and takes steps. So I think machine vision is going to have a big impact in the contract logistics field in the coming years.
Very interesting. Just before the last question, there is an audience question. It comes online, as many of you know, we have an online audience here. I'm sorry, almost the way to have to ask it, but it's worth asking. The question is for the panel, but probably for you, Dave. Do you know when the microchip supply issue will be resolved? And if you know the answer, I mean, maybe you don't want to actually say it, because we can place some bets somewhere else. But now, how does your company? But I think the crux of the question really, how does your company forecast microchip supply, and really how that has evolved and changed?
Yeah. I would say in terms of the forecast, I mean, microchips are definitely improving. We're seeing quarter-over-quarter improvements, and typically, from a forecasting standpoint, we get these kind of quarterly allocations that flow from, the wafer providers to the semi providers to the tier ones to GM, and so typically, we'd like to have much longer visibility, but we're kind of getting these quarterly increments, and we are seeing quarter-over-quarter improvements. I'd say the challenging part is there are, whereas before it was very, very widespread in terms of the amount of semiconductor constraints, so it is definitely narrowed, but there are still certain node families that we anticipate being constrained well through next year. So I think it's more specific. It's not nearly as widespread, but I don't think it's going to be behind us probably for another year or so, at least within certain nodes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. I think we'll go to the last question for the panel, which is the last question of our event, really. And it is looking ahead, and I mentioned at the beginning the big changes that we know are happening: electrification, sustainability, to the zero points that you mentioned, Dave. And I'm just interested to hear from the panel. For your businesses and in your supply chain and customers, some of the lessons from this crisis which we've been discussing, do you think they'll help you in being more successful in adapting and meeting some of these changes and challenges? I'm going to start with Mike. And again, it's not, obviously you're not building finished electric vehicles, but maybe it's reaching the sustainability targets or helping your customers to do it. However you want to take those lessons forward.
Yeah, the electrification will be very interesting, especially as the OEMs start to get involved in multiple tiers. I don't even know where lithium sits. Is that tier 600 or 3? I don't know, but it'll be interesting in that regard. From a contract logistics standpoint, for us, I think the lessons that we've taken away is we have to keep that service mindset. We have to keep resilience and build more resilience in our operations, because our customers then that transforms into their resilience. So I see that kind of 3 areas: labor, process, and geography. So being able to be less dependent on labor, being able to free up our labor to of doing non-value-added tasks to focus on actual decision-making, I think is key to resilience. Also, the same thing with process. Getting them away from doing processes that don't add any value, that can be automated, is key. And then from a geographic standpoint, how do we use our common process, our common systems to quickly shift our operations from different buildings to different buildings to enable our customers to be able to have a lot of flexibility in how they reroute their supply chains.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah. Thorsten.
I would like to take the sustainability topic in conjunction with that. So the COVID crisis was a little bit up in the race to steal the show in terms of what needs to be done to work against global warming. And this is not going away despite COVID, and it's coming back on the agenda. So what our learning is, we could also work on this probably biggest challenge we have on the entire planet, which is how we become more sustainable. And so investments into do everything more sustainable is crucial. And we have moved step forwards. So the one thing is with cars going into EV is a very good thing, but we believe it's not helping for the entire transportation area. And we have done very significant investments in biofuel, so basically collecting used cooking oil and with renewable energy, converting it into fuel and burn it. And by that, it becomes something where you don't release new CO2 in the atmosphere. That costs heavy money, and we have done it parallel to all the challenges we have been going through, and it becomes respective in the industry, and we see a lot of followers now going into the same investments. At a certain stage, maybe customers start really buying it because it costs more. And the vision we are driving as a learning is we can maybe even achieve that something like power to liquid, which could be a very big solution for the overall transportation, could be enabled. And with showing with biofuel, it works. And while showing with biofuel, it's not enough available to cope. So I think parallel to COVID, and that's a fascinating thing, we saw certainly a real route to complete CO2 zero transportation. And now it's about consumption of biofuel, and if that gets a certain degree, probably we get all the mineral companies in really investing in large power to liquid factories, and then new CO2 will be not the future anymore.
Very important points, and goes right back to our opening of the session yesterday with the Department of Energy. Alternative fuels and biofuels is an area pointed to from the government side. There is funding, so we have some resources and material we can share in that too, but I think it's a great point from an industry focus point as well. Dave, to kind of conclude, looking at what some of these lessons will mean and help you as you help GM transition to this 000 supply chain, what's the most important that we take forward?
Yeah, I think some of our key learnings have been really understanding how much reliance do we want on the tier ones controlling our destiny versus us controlling our destiny. And so there's, defining what is critical. I mean, I would see, certainly more vertical integration from our standpoint. We are taking control of securing our future in the battery electric space. We don't want to just source that to a supplier and put all of our reliance on a given supplier. So I think it's more of the collaborative relationships where it's more of a strategic relationship where GM has a heavy hand in it. Yeah. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest learnings as we move forward.
Yeah, I think there was even some announcements yesterday of another investment in lithium and on recycling side. So maybe not tier 600, maybe becoming actually more integrated, as you say.
Yep.
Well, those are some great points to leave on. It also shows there's a lot more to talk about as we go ahead and talk about that journey. But I want to thank all of you, Dave, Mike, and Thorsten for this great insight. Really fantastic way for us to close out the event.